When you think of literary and artistic works, that takes us straight to copyright. And when you look at names and images used in commerce, that takes us straight to trademarks and similar marks such as service marks. But there are other types of IP that can be recognized as well. Industrial designs, geographical indications are others, trade secrets are yet others, and there is a relatively new area of traditional knowledge that has been recognized across the globe in very many jurisdictions as one type of IP. Another thing that I would like to touch on briefly is just how the IP is governed. At the national level, for myself, I will speak very briefly about the Kenyan example. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I practice under the Kenyan law. And the foundation for intellectual property law in Kenya is basically given by the Constitution of Kenya. The new constitution promulgated in 2010 really addresses intellectual property in Article 40, where it talks of the protection of right to property. It actually goes deeper into pointing out that the government will recognize intellectual property, not just physical property and others. And also the same document in the Constitution of Kenya in Article 11, which addresses culture, talks about the significance of culture, and it talks in Article 11(2)(c), specific of the government of Kenya taking steps to protect the intellectual property of communities. In that context, that brings me back again to traditional knowledge, which I mentioned a little earlier. In Kenya, that's something that has been captured in the Constitution. Other laws in Kenya that talk about intellectual property are the Industrial Property Act, which basically covers patents, industrial designs, utility models, geographical indications, and so on. And that law actually also sets up the Kenya Industrial Property Institute, which is our national office for intellectual property matters. We also have the Trademark Act, which governs trademark registration and prosecution in Kenya. And that is also a function that is handled by the Kenya Industrial Property Institute. We do have the Copyright Act, which sets up the Kenya Copyright Board, and that handles registrations and other matters related to copyright. And a very novel thing that we have in Kenya is the Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions Act, set in motion in 2016, and that brings to life the constitutional provision, which I mentioned earlier in Article 11, to provide for the protection of communal rights under intellectual property. Another act that we have in Kenya that is relevant here is the Anti-Counterfeit Act that moves towards looking at enforcement. So we have the Anti-Counterfeit Agency, which is set up to work with all other relevant authorities. And the aim is to ensure that the enforcement bit of intellectual property rights is covered. In Kenya, we do have the Intellectual Property Bill, which is not a law yet, and that was put in place in 2020, which seeks to collapse a lot of these different acts into one, the Intellectual Property Act, and that will set up the Kenya Intellectual Property Office, where we will all go to for registrations and other matters related to intellectual property in Kenya. Moving forward to the regional and perhaps continental platform, we do have within there's the East African Community, and under that we do have the East African Community Intellectual Property Policy. It's known as the RIPP, Regional Intellectual Property Policy, and it really aims to streamline the different intellectual property laws across the East African region within the member states of the East African Community. That's something that is still ongoing in the framework of the wider East African Community integration process that is set to take a number of years. We are still at perhaps the earlier stages of that integration. Beyond that, we do have several other bodies, but I'll only mention two. The African Regional Intellectual Property Organization, ARIPO, which is set up by the Lusaka Agreement of 1976, with about 22 member states, which are also members of the African Union. And there's the efficiency in registrations and prosecution of applications. For instance, myself as an agent in Kenya, if I wanted to put in a registration in any of these other countries, I could look for an agent on the ground in those countries or register with ARIPO and file a registration for some intellectual property approval. They would receive one application distributed to the other national offices and kind of handle the administrative aspect of those different applications that might have. Beyond ARIPO, there is also the OAPI, WAPI, which is another treaty set up by the Bangui Agreement of 1977. And this has about 17 countries, mostly French-speaking countries in Africa, which also have a similar arrangement where if any of the member states, if you had an application from one of them, you could easily use the OAPI central office, which is in Yaoundé, Cameroon, to set up one application, which is then administered on your behalf in the required countries that you will be looking at. Very quickly, I'll just mention the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think that is yet another important legal framework that we should look at in Africa. And it does address the commercialization of intellectual property as one of the inter-African trade points that should be looked at for us to have better integration in the commercial sphere in Africa. And to finish up on the platform that I would like to lay for this discussion is the international stage. There's a lot of international sort of organizations like the Eurasian Patent Organization, the European Patent Office. But for me, I would like today to just mention the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is sort of the overall body across the globe, which looks into streamlining intellectual property matters. And I will also mention very quickly the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights that are known as TRIP. And that is really an annex to the Marrakesh Agreement of the World Trade Organization. And I think that's important in the context of commercialization as it comes up in this webinar here today. Moderator, Dr. Neba, I believe that's enough of the boring legal framework, but I think it sets a good ground for us to move into the actual discussions of today's topic. And thank you very much for your time. I'll hand it over back to you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That's very succinct and straight to the point. I think you've covered all the key things that somebody who hasn't interacted with the whole concept of IP and IP rights will be able to know where to go in terms of the national framework, regional, and even international framework. So thank you. I encourage participants who have questions that you want to direct to Joseph, you can send through the chat. And I encourage panelists to be able to look through the chats and see if they could respond to some of those particular questions. With this understanding, I'll just like us to move on to maybe at the area around insights on the intersection of public health and intellectual property rights in relation to patenting of health innovations and access to medicine. And my question is directed to Professor Folabi. Let's put it this way. So we know that it is common knowledge that investment in research in Africa is below par. It's very, very low. Very few countries actually invest more than 1% of their GDP in research and development. In your view, what are some of the implications of this inadequate investment in R&D on the research to innovation pipeline?
Thank you very much, Alphonsus. Thank you for Barrister Joseph for giving us that background, which was very instructive. I'm not an expert on intellectual property rights. I'm a researcher, and I do know that at the beginning of my career in the University of Lagos about 25 years ago, I had no idea about how to get grants to publish to do good research, talk less of thinking about patenting and intellectual property. It took probably about 10, 15 years before I found that out. And that's because the awareness about high quality research and the ability to create knowledge and innovation from high quality research so that you can have appropriate patents or trademarks, you know, it takes a while to get to that level, unfortunately. From day one in other institutions, from when you get in, you know that you're supposed to publish and you're supposed to get good grants in order to publish your work. In fact, that's the work of an academic in the US or the UK. They get in there and every other week they are, you know, writing grants, writing applications for grants. So the initial direction on entry is wrong and warped. So that is some of the problems that we have. As time has gone on, and in recent times now, especially with the advent of AI and the advent of the internet and so many resources that are available even without having that much economic resource, people that are coming in now have the opportunity to know that, there's certain things you can do, there's certain ways you can learn, educate yourself in proper research methodology so that you can carry out the appropriate work and also look at patenting your work. I mean, now we know that patenting your work is a very big advantage. It helps you control your intellectual rights. It helps you, advance in your field. You are looked at as a superior in your field. It's one of the things that even qualifies you for promotion and a lot of other things, and being at the top of the research intellectual chain. Now, in terms of implications of inadequate investments in research leading to intellectual property rights, it's unfortunate because when you can't get grants from your own country, the work that is relevant to your country, you're not able to solve the problems in your country. So an example for me is sickle cell, which I'm very passionate about. Nigeria has the highest number of people living with sickle cell disease in the world. But this is where it is most important. If you compare the amount of research in sickle cell with the amount of research in cystic fibrosis, which is much less common than sickle cell, if you just do a PubMed search now and put in sickle cell, and then another time put in cystic fibrosis, it's like 5 times the number of publications for cystic fibrosis, supported by huge amount of grants from the NIH, from all the different big organizations. But sickle cell is way lower, yet sickle cell is much more common, worldwide than cystic fibrosis. So the research that concerns us, it is important to have the resources to be able to do such high quality research and protect the knowledge that we get from such high quality research by patents. If we're not able to do that, then we're not able to carry out, to progress as a society, both scientifically and otherwise. So, I mean, it really encourages innovation if you have appropriate resources for IP. You can attract more funding the more patents you have. You're able to share knowledge with your co-researchers. You're able to, make your discoveries well known. The sky is the limit when it comes to being able to patent. And it's also, of course, it's quite commercially viable. There's some institutions in the US that have, patented companies within the university derived from their patenting. Things like the MRI machine came from the University of Nottingham by an academic there, and it's patented. And you can imagine what the university is making now from such property, in intellectual property. So it's unfortunate that we're not tapping into that, because it's not just for the researchers alone. It actually benefits the institutions, it benefits the government, it benefits the whole society if we are able to have enough resources in research leading to adequate intellectual property. Thanks.
For those deep insights, maybe just a follow-up question. So assuming that you were advising the Minister of Health or Education or Science and Technology in Nigeria, what would be your advice to them in terms of positioning Nigerian universities or African universities to better contribute to the knowledge economy through research and development and innovation?
I would say that I know that resources are scarce generally. I know that, there are many mouths to feed being in government. I'm not going to be the sort of person that says, oh, you're doing wrong, you're not doing enough, blah, blah, blah. So it's important to know that if you're on the other end, you have, a demand chain that you have to, what's the word, apportion different resources to. However, I would let them know that this particular investment in research and in the educational space in terms of good research and innovation is actually an extremely rewarding and lucrative sector, that if you put the funds into it, you will get huge gains back, especially if you do it strategically. So I'll suggest to them that they should look into areas where they can get these funds. If it is in VATs for different things, if it is in taxing some things that are already maybe that are luxuries, if it is in an education. So we actually have this education trust fund in Nigeria called TET Fund, and it does give a lot of grants. One of my grants in a sickle cell trial is from TET Fund, and it's a rather large fund for Nigerian standards, or for low LMIC standards. My first big grant came from Nigeria. But the problem is that it's not enough. That same trust fund has to do so many other things. So I would encourage them that they need to find the resources from elsewhere, because this is a place where it's going to give you a huge return on investment if you put in your money into the knowledge gap, or the educational knowledge institution in Nigeria. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Those insights are very deep and exciting. I hope other participants who are affiliated with government are actually taking note. Joseph, I would like to circle back to you. You did mention something about genetic resources and traditional knowledge. I just want to find out whether current IP protection and prosecution systems are adequate for protection and exploitation of traditional knowledge and genetic resources to be able to drive innovation on the continent. In your view, do you think there's a mismatch, or do you think we need maybe new laws and systems to be able to protect our traditional knowledge? We know, for instance, that there's been quite a number of innovative products that have been driven by our cultural and traditional practices and food systems, as an example. But given the criteria that are used to determine whether any innovation is patentable or not, the traditional knowledge and maybe some of the genetic resources that we have on the continent would never meet that criteria. Could you just share your thoughts within the legal fraternity or legal IP fraternity, how you think through some of these constraints with traditional knowledge and genetic resources?
Thank you, Dr. Neba. I'll just start with the Kenyan context. And I was actually quite surprised to look around as I was preparing for today and to find that at our local office, the Kenya Industrial Property Institute, as much as I mentioned that we do have an act, I myself as a regular practitioner did not know that they do have a traditional knowledge and genetic resources unit at their office. It's a place that I go to very frequently in my practice, and yet I did not know that it's there. So I think one immediate thing to point out is that there isn't enough awareness or out there just here in Kenya. And I also feel that this is a situation that is existing regionally across the continent and internationally, in my view. But then again, just to point out very quickly, when we talk about traditional knowledge and genetic resources, we're looking at community rights, which is a relatively new area of intellectual property. When we think of trademarks, copyrights, patents, you look at them as being owned by one person or by a company, the inventors in the case of a patent or a utility model, and so on. But here we're talking about community rights. In Kenya, we have this cloth known as the kikoi, which came out from one cultural area of the republic. It's part of the culture of one of the areas in Kenya. And yet somebody in the UK or a company there was trying to trademark it and then use that for commercial gain, which meant that the place where it really originated from would not get any benefit. And we also had the same thing with something known as the kiondo, a woven bag that is made in some parts of Kenya and was actually about to be trademarked in, I believe, Japan. So when we look at the Kenyan situation and then move again to the East African situation, ARIPO and beyond within the continent, I don't think it's been addressed very well in the policy documents at the East African community level, and also in the treaties, ARIPO, OAP, and the agreement that sets up the African continental free trade area. But then again, that gives us the opportunity, especially at the AFC African free trade area level. That's the place where I would say that since it's much more broader, it covers about 51, 52 countries. And if we could look at that document and improve it to cover traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and communal rights of that nature, I think in Africa we can capture it very well. And Dr. Neba, I think I'll stop there and hand it back to you. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, very, very eloquently. Thank you very much. So again, attendees, participants, if you have questions, please keep them coming. Don't forget to tweet. Don't forget to use our hashtag. Let's create the awareness that we want to create and make our continent a better place. Let me then move on to Marianne from Kemri Wellcome Trust. Marianne, we have a lot of clinical trials taking place on the continent. And by implication, it means that there's a lot of clinical data that is being generated. Would like you to share your maybe experience on some of the considerations in intellectual property protection of clinical trial data when clinical trials happen on the continent. What are some of the dynamics as far as power is at play in collaborations between the global north and the global south? Over.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Neba. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're joining from. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this important webinar. I come from the Kemri Wellcome Trust Research Program, which actually is an institution that is founded based on a collaboration. The collaboration is we receive funding from the Wellcome Trust, and we collaborate with the Kemri Medical Research Institute, which is based in Kenya, and with support from the University of Oxford in the UK. So we are actually a north-south collaboration in essence. We have a very strong leadership and portfolio in terms of clinical research, and we mostly focus on, not exclusively, but a lot of our focus is on the vaccine theme. Now, in terms of this brings a lot of considerations in terms of funding source, sponsorship for the trial, and also intellectual property in terms of the products that are being tested. We've tested a lot of clinical trial products that are first in man. So these are new vaccine candidates that have not yet been registered for public use. And this brings a lot of considerations in terms of who holds the marketing portfolio for that product, who is the funder, and also who is sponsoring the trial, because there are different legal and funding financial considerations in that aspect. So from our point of view, we have a lot of training and engagement that we involve our researchers in to try and address and educate them, to create awareness even as they're being approached or negotiating collaborative engagements in order to conduct research, so that they are aware of some of these considerations. We have established a research governance office, which I oversee, that tries to address all these supportive functions and features, so that researchers are aware early enough, even when they're doing their grant proposals. So we support with contract review, making sure that it addresses some of these key things that are normally left out. Publication, data ownership. When you're coming into these contracts, who will have control, who will have access, who has rights in terms of making decisions on how long data should be retained, who can share it, and also considerations now in terms of data protection, in terms of the personal data that you have, and also the supporting ecosystem. So there's national policies, there's different aspects to consider in terms of jurisdiction, and in most of these cases, the data provider or data subject is an African continent resident. So we also have to take into consideration those ethical considerations of their contribution to research, and that general community that they come from, what benefits can they also accrue? So we also want to try and expand sharing of progress while not impeding the progress of discoveries and technologies, because at the end of the day, we do want to facilitate faster access of potential therapies to the patient. But it should not be at the cost of researchers in Africa also having an opportunity to grow and to contribute to these findings, especially where the data is coming from African residents. So other considerations are what we support is when the contract comes, we want to see what the roles and responsibilities are of each party. We want to understand the financial commitments. We want to be in a position where we're negotiating for protections for our researchers in terms of their ability to publish, their ability to analyze, even though our technologies might be a bit slower, and access to that data to maybe follow up on future questions regarding that specific therapeutic area. So we embed this in the negotiations of the contract. We embed this also in the grant applications. So we support proposal review. There's also an additional layer of support in terms of ethical review. So a lot of these studies will go through internal review systems. Once the funding is more or less secure, you'll then go in to do your ethics application. And in the case of clinical trials, there's a regulatory review involved as well. So in terms of that ethical review, the committee is also, again, looking at with an external eye at the privacy protection, confidentiality, control and use of data, sharing, in order to look at the effects on patient populations. And they take into account ethical considerations around the different rights in order to safeguard participant interests. And also in consideration of national jurisdiction and what our requirements are in terms of research policy in the relevant country. Then there's also regulatory compliance. I mentioned a little bit about data protection being one such requirement. There's also clinical trial regulations. For example, in Kenya, we do have a post-trial access requirement. Most studies have to take into consideration access to some of these products where the communities have taken time, contributed to this research. For example, for a new vaccine, and they are not able to afford purchasing that vaccine, or they are not able to access it. So there's a legal requirement in Kenya as well to have a plan in place on post-trial access and make these considerations well in advance. So regulatory compliance is another thing that we look out for and support our researchers in making sure that this is addressed. And then the other general thing is just capacity building, providing empowerment, training, so that these researchers can also be confident enough in their engagements to defend benefit sharing, to defend rights of the researchers, to defend a position where we can have equitable access to all the, irrespective of global North or global South considerations. So I'll stop there and maybe take some clarification questions from you as well. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's quite fine. I wanted to see if Professor Afolabi could jump in and just share maybe a bit of our own experience in terms of how clinical trials are dealt with in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually going to ask a question from Marianne to do with that. I wanted to ask that because you were talking about what's it called, the agreements and how you try to negotiate the contracts. Now, when it comes to sub-award agreements, that is, one is having an agreement with another body, you are the chief investigator, you have another team that, I've had a pushback a few times from especially the Global North researchers or research governance team about ensuring that the publications they can publish, at will. I had to go back and say, okay, what we need to do is it has to be with the knowledge of we, the chief investigators. And in fact, I mean, we have to agree before you can go ahead and publish and phrase it in that way. I'm just wondering if you have that experience. Is it that you sometimes need to say, okay, fine, we can all just jump on it and publish as at will, even though we are the ones who brought in the work and the grants? How does that work with you, and what have you experienced in that way?
Yeah, so we did have that initially. We had those problems of we didn't have a point of reference to strengthen our argument for why we should do this. So we've had a lot of advancement. Like I said, we are a partnership between University of Oxford with a lot of support from the Kenya Medical Research Institute, which is a government mandated body to conduct research in Kenya. So KEMRI have implemented a lot of policies to strengthen and protect the rights of local researchers. So they have invested in a lot of policies that guide publication, guide IPR, and so we reference those at an institutional level, which greatly strengthens our position. So we revert back to say, this is an institutional government mandated policy that requires that we find a mutual way to agree. So most of the time what we say is we give each other 30 to 60 days to review and mutually agree that this publication can then be rolled out. And then we also have other softer policies that help guide on authorship, because that's another aspect that is usually a huge bone of contention, where you end up being a middle author, yet you are the local PI that drove the whole study. So sometimes in those big consortiums, we have, not everyone is happy with it, but sometimes one of the solutions is to publish as a consortium and not as individual authors. Then we provide a listing of everyone and the level of contribution that they made, which in some instances has helped with the much bigger consortium-related projects, and at least it showcases everyone's input in that project. I hope I've answered your question, Professor Afolabi.
You have, thank you, Dr. Marianne. So I think that, thank you very much. One of the important things that came out to me from this is that North-South dichotomy sometimes, because for a lot of work up till recently, the chief investigators are often, located in the global North, and then you're coming to do the work in the South, and then it's, it's the country PI is now just being like the person who helps and is not being recognized appropriately. That itself isn't on. And what is good is that they're beginning to realize this. The whole global research community is beginning to realize this, and there even some NIHR grants and a few other, and I know Gates for sure now are trying to ensure that the PIs are actually in country, located in the country where they are working and carrying out and governing this research. For me, that's what I've been involved in recently, and so the conversations I have about authorship are things that I bring up and say, okay, let's discuss this. If, for example, I have some PhD students in my research team that are affiliated during their PhDs, split sites with some northern universities like Karolinska Institute in Sweden, like some London school universities. So what we do is that we sit down and we agree on the authorship. Okay, so you are the one supervising the PhD. I'm the payer of the grant. How do we, decide? How do we agree who gets what position? And also, for example, just many different agreements where we sit down and agree on it. But with me definitely being the big force on the table because I'm the chief investigator and I have the knowledge of all what we're doing. And these things are important even towards the eventual, intellectual property that we're talking about. The authorship, the publication rights, and so on. They are really key. So
Yes.
yeah, I think that transition to making sure that the work is steeped in the country where it's been done or in the area where it's been done, including the governance and the direction of the research itself, is very, very key in global health research.
Yes, and for us, actually establishing a research support office has helped researchers a lot in terms of creating an awareness and empowering them to then make these arguments, and also providing them with the policy references and the legal framework that can support those arguments in order to strengthen them appropriately. Like one example is in Kenya, it is a requirement by the regulatory authority that the PI is resident in Kenya. So what they will ask to see is a practicing license from the Kenyan, licensing body to ensure that that investigator. So actually, the arrangement ends up flipping. Even though you have a chief investigator who is from the global north, the actual directive authority is the local PI in terms of the regulator. So then the chief investigator becomes almost like a co-PI. Direction and everything is from the local PI, which is now a requirement. So for us, that helps with making our case and also advocating for full responsibility as a local PI, instead of just taking direction when local context sometimes is not taken into consideration. And then another aspect of support is our local institution also requires that when we are dealing with materials that are being transferred, our material transfer agreements, it is an institutional policy requirement that there must be evidence of capacity building. And where possible, you are advised to budget in advance for a local resident to then go abroad if samples need to go abroad, learn the technology, and facilitate a way of transferring that technology back home. And recently, we've also strengthened this by ensuring that even if samples go abroad, there's always a copy maintained locally. Because again, there's that drain of samples that were collected. And again, it's a burden on participants to have and collect samples where they were already there, but you no longer have access because they were all shipped abroad. And once funding ended, access or facilities to ship them back is not available. So again, there's been a lot of strengthening at an institutional and national level, so that at least now we are at a stronger point of negotiating our place. And again, that helps us facilitate when it comes to discussions about IPR. All those things have been embedded in advance. We have documentation and record keeping in place so that we know we can reference contracts, we can reference protocols and everything that was written in advance. And that really helps with putting forward these applications when the time comes.
Okay.
That's so key. Sorry, just before you move on, I'm so sorry. I know we're monopolizing a bit, but I needed to just say something. So, I mean, it's so what you said about all the protocols and the SOPs and, everything, governance being in place is so key. And that's something that our current Vice Chancellor, Professor Shade Ogunshola, the first female Vice Chancellor of the University of Lagos, she's the one that championed even having the research office at the college when she was the provost of the College of Medicine. She's a clinical microbiologist and fantastic researcher. And she's the one who championed this, setting up of a proper research office in the college. I mean, people think, we always think, oh, why are we wasting time on these other things when we can just do it? But the truth is that you don't just do things. You have to actually have so much structure. And that is what the Global North has over us, if you ask me. The idea of having structure for everything. So she said that had that set up, and she also is the one that, as when she was Deputy Vice Chancellor, Management Services, Development Services, set up the intellectual property units in the University of Lagos. So UNILAG also has all these things in place of ensuring that, you know, all the documentation is there and things are done properly. I'm not speaking for Nigeria, but I know that that definitely has made a big difference for the University of Lagos. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. So what I hear is that policies, structures, and champions are very, very important in ensuring that we get the best out of these interactions and stuff. So I would like to move on to a very important question, and I would like to invite three of the panelists to give it a shot. Dr. Oni Yire, Marianne, and Professor Afolabi, and also Joseph. So it's been argued that intellectual property in some cases is counterproductive to universal access to public health on the continent. So how is IP limiting public health access, and what can we do differently? So let's start with the IP expert. Joseph, maybe thoughts, maybe just briefly. Then we move on to Marianne and then to Dr. Oni Yire. I'm really having a tough time with the name. I'm sorry. Okay, Joseph, if you're still there.
Yes, I'm here, Dr. Neba. I was also just getting confused because, you know, there are two Josephs on the panel today.
No, I qualified as the IP expert.
Yes.
I know the other one is the innovator, so we're still coming to him.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just be brief, and I think your question goes to whether the IP laws could be limiting, you know, access to health
public health. Yes.
in the continent. I personally think that they are not. What I think is happening is that there is a lot of, for instance, research. I really come into interaction with a lot of, you know, I follow the monthly industrial property journal where patents, utility models, and so on are advertised before the certificates are issued. And you do see a lot of health-related patents, utility models, so many things happening there. But what I do think is that many people do not know about what needs to be done from a legal standpoint in order to bring those to the fore. So if you are not in Kenya, if you're not aware of the monthly industrial property journal, you wouldn't know where to look to have an idea of what's happening in innovation in the public health space or anything that could fit there. And beyond that, we also don't have a lot of information about how to commercialize. So a lot of the public health related patents and utility models that I see come out of research. Professor Afolabi has talked about, you know, herself being a researcher and a lot around that. So we have a lot of patents in the health space and public health related patents coming from universities and other research agencies. Their advertised certificates are issued, and I feel like they just go back to their certain institutions, universities or whatever, and sit there. But there is actually procedure to license those patents and make money for the universities themselves, for the researchers and innovators. And perhaps there's a disconnect between, you know, once you get that certificate and have your patent registered in public health and taking it one step forward to license it out to someone who can actually commercialize that. But just to finish, I think that perhaps apart from the lack of knowledge amongst practitioners, researchers, and really the market itself, there could be an argument for a situation where all of us are not really willing to put this information out. A lot of universities want to keep those innovations that they've registered for themselves. So sort of to have the bragging rights, if I can use that informal term, and not bring that out into the public. So there isn't much that the law is really inhibiting, apart from us who know the law and the institutions that really have the law, bringing that to the fore, sensitizing everyone out there, innovators, researchers, players in the market like pharmaceutical industries, government, and bringing that together. And perhaps there could be an argument for a kind of a platform, perhaps online or in another fashion, that allows for this exchange of information, exchange of ideas, and commercialization to take place. I think I'll end my personal opinion at that point and hand it over to you, Dr. Neba.
Thank you, Dr. Faith Oni Yire. Let's hear from you, and especially from the government's perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. It's nice to be part of this great panel discussion. I have my prof there. Okay, so talking about intellectual property, we just started something here at the Lagos State Ministry of Health. We want to establish the intellectual property desk. And that is because we have lots of research going on. In fact, think about the, I think, well, yeah, 2020, during the COVID era, we did a lecture there in the public space. It's there in the public health space. It's there all over. The findings, everything. Then we start down. We have done a lot of work. What do we do? Again, we have to note something. Once you publish, there are some things tied to it. You cannot say you own it anymore. So what do we do? At that point, APHRC came on board. I think it was by 2021 we started talking. Then by 2022, we made their intention known. By 2023, July, we had this stakeholders meeting where we told them that we have lots of research work out there. What are we going to do? We discovered new things. How do we go about, what are those things that we discovered? And can we patent them? And so the discussion started and we had that meeting. So what am I saying in essence is that intellectual property is not hindering research. However, there is low awareness. People are not aware of what they have. As researchers, we have the power. What is research? We are trying to find out something that is not clear to us and to make it clear. At the end of the day, we have our findings. Then what do we do with it? Professor Folabi said something, and I noted it down, that most times, malaria is one of our major problems, okay, like sickle cells, he said, but we do get grants to do some other things. Which are not really relevant to us. Grants to do some other things which are not really relevant to us. And at times, when we discover these things, when we identify new things, we don't know what to do with them, then somebody will just come from somewhere and invest and take it away from us. And so we have lost it. Another aspect that the lawyer spoke about just now is the commercialization. It's fine to patent, but the commercialization aspect of it is also key. And somebody once said, yes, it's good to have grants, but when you do research and you find out new things, innovation, creativity, you are creative, you are creating things, and then you patent, you have your rights and everything, such a person, you are actually fulfilling or, you are attaining the sustainable development goals. Because the number one sustainable development goal is no poverty. And once you are able to patent something, you are leaving the realm of poverty. So with that, I don't think intellectual property can hinder public health research. Rather, I think we need to create awareness. And that is why we are trying to do something at the Lagos State Ministry of Health. We had a 2-day workshop to create awareness. And, people were like, okay, so what's the next step? What do we do? I've done this so many research work. They are not, there's nothing to show for it. Just to put it lightly, to show for the research of being a professor. You have written so many theses. Here and there, intellectual property decks created with sensitize the people, create awareness, and also help us to commercialize. Commercialization is very key when we are talking about IP. It is very, very key. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you. Marianne, your thoughts on IP being, in some cases, considered to hinder access to global public health?
So in terms of being the, if Africa, we're looking at it from the perspective of being the innovator, I agree with the comments from Joseph and Dr. Oniire. In terms of understanding the requirements, puts you in a good position to commercialize and exploit these opportunities. Now, when we are on the receiving end, I do have a counter argument to that. As we saw in terms of the progress in terms of research within COVID, this was very quick. Some of these platforms had been established in other countries and not localized in Africa. I'm speaking about, for example, mRNA technology in terms of vaccination. It was not new, but it was not really available in Africa. And we did contribute to a lot of research in that space, but because we were not, should I say, not very forward-looking or not very proactive with our established partners, we had not considered embedding within our collaborations aspects of equity, aspects of strengthening things like TRIPS within even our contracts, and also looking forward to, if these situations arise, what are our roles and responsibilities as established collaborations? What resulted was that there was a lot of technology that was not able to be transferred because there were a lot of patents that could not be exempted. TRIPS had to come in, but even that brought a lot of contestation from existing patent holders. And even till now, there's a whole paper that was written on just the challenges of patenting and tech transfer, just specifically in mRNA and specifically with COVID vaccines. We have not even looked at other platforms or other disease areas. And there was a whole web diagram, spider diagram of all the complexities, the heat map of the different patents that are held, not only patents in products or processes, but also trade secrets and proprietary information that could not be shared. And I feel this really impacted the African continent in terms of the fact that we were not embedded in that area of work, and we could not propel and progress some of the work that we've done. This also sometimes is the feature that we see when we have a product, but we do not have capability to produce it locally. So we have inventions, we have candidate vaccines that have been generated by Africans, but we need to then have a licensing agreement in order to do larger scale or even proof of concept clinical trial manufacture. We need to outsource this to other partners. And then in these negotiations, we end up losing a lot of our proprietary rights because we're not considering patenting, or the information we have contributed to thus far does not constitute something that is patentable. So those are my, devil's advocate side of view, and also the supportive side of view where, yes, in terms of us being the innovator, there's a lot of opportunities. We can leverage that. We can generate funding to have a stronger financial position. But in terms of the other side, when we're talking about global collaborations to hasten, especially in response to epidemics, sometimes we are on the wrong end of the stick. Over.
Okay, thank you. Let me now seize this opportunity to invite Joseph Githiru to share his experiences with us on his personal journey or lived experience as an innovator in Kenya. So Joseph, tell us what your experience has been in terms of patenting the HIPAC and the solar dryer process and technologies, the cost. Just share with us and some of the challenges that young Kenyan innovators face in patenting and protecting their innovations, and what can be done differently. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alfonso. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Joseph Githiru. I am an Obama leader and 40 Under 40 Africa. But in this particular context, I've been asked to talk about innovation and what we've been doing at my startups. And I'd like to go into that. So first of all, I agree with almost every sentiment that has been mentioned by the previous speakers, including Marianne and what you've just completed to mention. It's really insightful. So my name is Joseph Gubiru, as I mentioned. Currently, I run 2 startups. One of them is called Hirepack. At Hirepack, we are converting water hyacinth into biodegradable plastics. So basically, we're using one problem, which is water hyacinth, and it's the world's most problematic aquatic weed, to solve another problem of plastic waste pollution. And my second startup, which was not included in the bio for this one, it's called MC2. At MC2, we are using AI technology. We are leveraging on AI as an early warning system for illegal logging, that's deforestation, charcoal burning, and wildfires. Currently, we are running that in some forests in Kenya in collaboration with the Kenya Forest Service. So my experience in patenting processes has been a bit, honestly, not a walk in the park. And I hold some views that have been mentioned by Marianne as well. Because the thing I think about innovations and patenting and all this is that they should be people-centric. If patenting is okay, but if it does not lead to changing the lives and livelihoods of people and communities, or if it does not lead to commercialization and monetization, I think it only stays on paper, I think then it's probably useless. So the very first innovation that we had that you've mentioned was on a solar dryer that is now being used by pyrethrum farmers to revive the pyrethrum farming in Kenya. So part of the reason why pyrethrum farming failed in Kenya in the 80s and 90s was because it was getting expensive for the industries to dry the pyrethrum flowers and into the right degree of hardness and moisture content that was required. So when I was in campus a few years back, I came up with this solar dryer that is now being used by now farmers across the country. And I happened to work closely with the Pyrethrum Board and some other US-based agencies. And that was the very first lesson I had in patenting, because I didn't get to patent it, so I had it as open source. A few months back, I was watching television just randomly, and I saw these farmers saying tunashukuru serikali kwa kutupatia hii kitu, which translates roughly to we thank the government for giving us those solar dryers. But the thing is, in the spirit of collaboration and accelerating the whole progress, and I didn't get to patent it fast. So first the speed and the number one, the fast. What happened is that other people got in, and it was taken over by almost everyone else, which no regrets on that though. So on the second, so when I was launching my startup, the Hirepack one, I was a bit aware of it. So in collaboration with Kipi, which Joseph and your team are doing some amazing work, I got to have at least the very first patent that I had, which was on the whole hyacinth processing and what we are doing about it. And when looking back into what's working for innovators and for the startup scene, at least in the continent, I've been privileged to engage with a number of top startups and innovators in the continent. And I think the best mix has been one that has patents, trademarks, and copyrights. And it's been a bit challenging for us because when we have continuous improvements and executions, then you get to a point where your first patents are not necessarily what you had, are not necessarily holistic and do not disrupt the markets enough as what you're doing currently at the moment. And what is working for startups is when you accelerate the whole progress of innovation and commercialization, you tend to bring in brand loyalty and strong company culture and strong marketing culture. So what happens is that consumers get to know you, and you don't necessarily have to rely on patents to sell your products and to go ahead with what you're doing. And so on my second startup currently, the MC21 that you're dealing with AI, again, a lot of AI technology has been researched from the United States and not here in Africa. And I have a feeling that you're being left out of the AI race, and we are having to play catch up on that. And so the thing about it is that a lot of models that we are having on large language models and so on AI are already open sourced. So you can't patent something that's already open sourced. And so what you have is you have to bring in a new aspect of whatever you're trying to do and try to put it in a way such that no one else has tried to figure it out, and trying to make it, upscale it in such a dynamic way that brings both effectiveness in terms of the product, and brings meaning in terms of how it goes to impact people and the society in general. So yes, that's my story in this context of innovation and patenting.
So
Thank you so much.
Tell us, thank you very much, Joseph. Tell us, how much did it cost you to obtain your patent? How many patents do you have, and how much did each of them cost, and how long did it take? Just rough,
Wow.
if you don't have the, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, rough figures. So I think the good thing that we have in the Kenyan space that Kipi has implemented is the provisional patent. So obtaining a provisional patent costs I think about 1,000 shillings if the costs have not been raised. Getting a good patent costs I think 3,000 shillings or something. And now the duration for getting a provisional patent, it takes a couple of days. For getting a patent, the full patent, it takes a really long time, because they have to do their background research. They have to put in these assessors who go to check what has been done previously and what is being done right now, and so on. So far, I have 2 of them under different brand names. And again, it's not been such a walk in the park. We've had to bring in a couple of experts to try and help us on the same, because this is not typically something that you're not taught in an undergraduate class, and you don't have it in your curriculum. So you are thrown into the deep end, and you have to learn how to navigate it on your own.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just post one more question to our participants from Nigeria and from Kenya, so they can answer based on their perspectives from the 2 countries, and then we can open the discussions up for questions from the attendees. So let's just think of the trends in the patenting and commercialization of health innovations environment in Kenya and Nigeria. So what are the awareness levels of intellectual property rights among Kenyans and Nigerian innovators? And what are some of the key process or systemic challenges that they face in order to maybe get and use patents? So I'll just leave it open. We can, of course, our IP specialist, Joseph Amisi, would be a good start.
Thank you, Dr. Neba. I'll just run through some challenges that I myself have faced as a practitioner. And in doing that, I'll pick up from our innovator who's just left off. And that really goes to sensitization. That's the point that I'd like to start with. There isn't, in my view, enough knowledge about the laws and the procedures. And especially when it comes to patents, as we are focusing on patents and more specifically in the health area. In Kenya, when you look at the Industrial Property Act and the regulations there, and there are such very detailed requirements when it comes to drafting a patent. For instance, the size of the font, the spacing, down to numbering of different lines as you're drafting a patent. How to present it, the description, the claims, the drawings, and then to fill out the forms and make sure you have 3 copies of each. I think that's a little bit too technical for the everyday inventor. And that really lends itself to people like myself who studied law and can take the time to really look at it. So I think there need to be some forums where people like myself as patent agents, KIPI itself having the patent examiners there, they're very helpful. Our innovator just spoke about going to KIPI, and I'm sure in his as he was approaching them, just asking them questions, asking for guidance. That's another helpful area where knowledge about the technical aspects of a patent and what to do can be gained. But I think there's more that can be done, and forums such as this bring it to the fore, and we can now take it offline to more detailed training programs and things like that. Another big challenge that we face from the innovator and practitioners perspective is commercialization. Again, I'll just say that commercialization involves perhaps licensing. You don't have to sell your patent outright, which is the other way that you could commercialize it. So, you could still own it, but give a license to someone under certain terms, under a contract, and let them commercialize it, bring it to market, and you get some money out of it. I don't think there's much knowledge about licensing in Kenya specifically. There was a study carried out, which I was a part of, between KIPI and the Georgetown University in the US about 2 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago. And we found that since 1930 or early 1930s, when there was patent law in Kenya, there was only one registered licensed patent. When you license a patent, you need to file some documents at the national office. And we only found one. And I'm happy to say that was one that I did, in terms of drafting, getting the certificate and licensing out. But I was the only one who took the step that the law requires to register it. I'm sure there are many others out here, party to party, but they've not been registered. And so, that brings up another question. Are you breaking the law? Is the law too stringent? Is it trying to stop you from getting into a private commercial contract with somebody else? But I think that's yet another area of challenge, the commercialization, and there's so much that we can discuss around that. I would not go into it. In closing, I'll just speak about efficiency of filing applications. Here in Kenya, when we are doing patents, we still need to take the physical documents. You draft your patent, you print out the form, and you actually have to take a whole trip to the patent office at KIPI to lodge it and all that. In this day and age where there's so much going on in terms of using the digital platforms, I think that is something that we can improve on here in Kenya, because you can see it happen at the regional level, the continental level. ARIPO has an online system that works. The World Intellectual Property Organization has an online system that works. And on that point, I do see that our office, KIPI, has kind of redone their website over the last 2 to 3 weeks. My personal hope is that they are moving towards setting up that platform for us as practitioners in the legal field, and for innovators in general to be able to step up there and just put in your application and follow it online for ease of prosecution. Lastly, I think enforcement is another challenging area. And our enforcement bodies here in Kenya, the Anti-Counterfeit Authority, and on copyright, we have the Kenya Copyright Board, both of which link into the Kenya Police and other investigative agencies. I believe a lot more can be done to kind of sensitize people about counterfeit goods. Any other aspects when it comes to patent, you'll be talking about infringement and the legal steps that can be taken to secure your intellectual property. Moderator, Dr. Neba, I think that's enough for me for now, so I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then maybe Marianne, just tell us what you think are the challenges within the research community as far as IP and patenting is concerned.
I think a lot of it is awareness, being aware of what is available to them. And then planning early enough to take these into consideration in terms of negotiations when conducting research, planning for the future. So having a longer term research strategy that outlines what the scope of this research is beyond just the project. And then also having supportive policies, governance structures to be able to support their negotiations. I'll leave it at that and let others also comment.
Okay, so let's hear from Dr. Faith Oniire about the Nigerian experience. I note that Professor Afolabi had indicated that she was going to drop off at 4, so I suppose she's already done that. So, Dr. Faith Oniire, you now carry the Nigerian flag, so tell us.
Okay, thank you very much. For us in Nigeria, yes, the awareness is low, very low. People are not aware of what they stand to gain or something for anything. They are not even aware about intellectual property. Most researchers are not. And that's one thing we discovered when we had this 2-day workshop. The people were not really aware. And so we need to do something about sensitizing the people. Another thing is that, you see, when people conduct research, they need to be intentional about the research. They need to be intentional. Now, you want to conduct a research, you need to, you know, identify what do I want to do? Now, what do I want to do with my findings? And the research we are going to conduct must be new, maybe generate something new. Find a solution to something. Because if not, then, so we are not telling people to be intentional. Now you want to conduct a research. Are you intentional? What do you want to gain from this research that you want to do? So that you won't say, oh, I've discovered something and NOTAP, because we have an agency called NOTAP in Nigeria that they do register our patents. They say, no, NOTAP is against me. They don't want me to register it. It's not that, but because it's not something new. So that's another issue that researchers will say, oh, they are not registering my products or stuff like that because it's not new. So we are telling researchers, you need to be creative, you need to be intentional, and you need to be creative. Again, data. We need to be able to use our data to inform policies, make decisions. You know, our data culture is quite low. So we need to be able to do something about our data, and then the financial support to actually conduct this research is another challenge that we have. So if we can work on our awareness, if we can support research, and then if we can do relevant research, I think then all will be well. Thank you, and over.
Thank you so much. I like the phrase relevant research. That's very, very instructive. It's my pleasure now to open the discussion to the attendees for any burning questions they may have. But before we do that, I see there's a question on the chat. I suppose Joseph Amisi would be best to answer this one. It says, let me see, there is usually, no, not that, I think there is the issue of software development. Now it's scrolling down. There is usually a clause in consultancy agreements that all IP will be owned by the hiring firm. Would the law allow a consultant who has signed off IP rights to reclaim these when the product has been commercialized, or they will remain bound by the contract they signed?
Thank you, Dr. Neba. I'd actually seen that question on the chat earlier and responded to it. I believe it was asked by Joseph Wangombe, but I'll just move quickly through my answer to Joseph Wangombe for the benefit of everyone else here. In Kenya specifically, when it comes to software, and we could have software that really brings out some good in public health, and so I think I can address this quickly. Software falls under copyright in Kenya. In other jurisdictions, code and software may fall under patent, for instance, in the US and I think in the UK and other jurisdictions. But here it falls under copyright. And the principle, there's a principle in intellectual property and a lot in copyright known as the work for hire principle, WFH, where when you contract someone, for instance, if I contracted Mr. Wangombe to develop some software for me, and we have an agreement where he's giving me those services, then he's considered to benefit from the fees that I pay him under that contract. But the product of the work that he's doing for me, the work I have hired him for, the intellectual property becomes mine. And so I think it's really important for sensitization again to anyone who's getting into such contracts, people with the knowledge, the skills to work on software, come up with code, and create things for public good, public health, and any other areas in the intellectual property space. And also just to make sure that they are very keen at the contracting phase. Because once you've entered into a contract, that's a civil agreement between the parties. And later on, if you wanted to regain your intellectual property, you probably have to demonstrate that you are forced into that contract or lied to or something like that, which is very difficult. So it's better to get into contracts from a point of knowledge and to seek expert advice wherever there are any questions. It goes even down to just visiting the country office at KIPI if you probably couldn't see a lawyer or can't afford one. You can visit KIPI. For software, you go to the Kenya Copyright Board, and then I'm sure they're willing to walk you through understanding what you might be getting into before you get into a big mess. I think that's where I'll leave it, and back to you, Dr. Neba.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Questions? I hope we are tweeting. I hope we are on LinkedIn. Yes, the word must go out. IP is very, very important. It can make instant millionaires from the work we do. So don't lose the opportunity by not being aware. So you can just speak, unmute your microphone and speak, or lift your hand. Let's see how we go. Audience. Usually, when there are no questions from audience, it means the panel has done a great job. That you can never doubt that. Okay. Oh, somebody says they don't have the right to ask. So how do we do this? My APHRC team, maybe you can advise.
Thank you, Alphonsus. We managed to respond to the questions in the Q&A section. Our panelists were gracious enough to go into detail to respond to those questions. So I think that's all from our end. Yeah.
Okay. So I believe when were we supposed to stop? Are we over time or still have some time?
We can wrap up now. Thank you.
Okay. So fellow participants and our panelists, I think it's been great engaging with you on this topic. Yes, what has come out clearly are issues around lack of awareness, maybe structures, champions, policies. There have been quite a number of them. But I believe that we have started the conversation. We don't have to wait till the next 26th of April 2025 to revisit this. I think we can tweet about it. We can be provocative on X, or X formerly Twitter, on LinkedIn, and just keep the conversations going, especially within our research institutions on the continent. And why not within the research, within the innovation, the broader innovation ecosystem on the continent. So I want to take this moment on behalf of the African Population Health Research Center and the Catalyze Impact Initiative, which is one of our major programs, to thank you profusely for making the time to honor our invitation and for the exciting contributions that you have given. We will be in touch, we'll continuously engage, and I hope that we can make Africa a much more better place than it is today through intellectual property and intellectual property rights. So thank you very much. And you all enjoy the rest of your day, and so long.